Welcome, welcome. If that sounds like a dog in the background, it is. um, Welcome to our Pacific Zen Luminary series. Tonight we have Lewis Hyde, and we'll introduce him a little bit more in a moment. But I thought maybe we could just sit for just a minute and let people come in quietly, and then we'll introduce Lewis and then hand it over to him. So let me just ring the bell. Searching for the ox. Searching for the ox. Series of 10 ox herding pictures that you all know. Lewis translated. Searching, pushing through endless underbrush, wide waters, distant mountains, darkening path, strength exhausted, spirit weary, no hint of where to hunt. Just hear the evening cicada sing in the sweet gum grove. Searching, searching. Well, thank you, Lewis Hyde, for joining us tonight. I'm just so thrilled, and I was so excited when I got an email back from you some months ago saying that you would indeed come on our Pacific Zen Luminaries series, which is a Monday night event, generally once a month. And I got really steeped into your books. You published the Gift, of course, back in 1983, and then sometime later, a decade or so, Trickster Makes This World, and then the book that we'll be looking at tonight, a primer for forgetting, which you said that Dogen, Zenji Eihei Dogen, was very central to the thought process in this book. So I thought that would be a good thing to investigate with Lewis Hyde. And I think most of you know Professor Hyde. He's a MacArthur Fellow, many awards, taught creative writing, was head of the creative writing department at Harvard, Kenyon College for many years, and just a tremendous storyteller, one of the greatest storytellers I think I've listened to. And so I hope we get a little bit of that tonight. So thank you all for coming. And Lewis, I wanted to sort of hand it over to you if we could, and maybe you could just put some material out on the table for us.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. My own practice has always involved sitting in many different situations. And yes, Dogen Zenji was one of the triggers for this book. So what I thought I would do was describe the book and read some short passages from it. I'm not going to concentrate on the parts that are about Buddhism because, you know, everybody here's a Buddhist, you don't need to hear more about it, but we can get into it as we when we do the discussion in Q&A. So I should say that this book is an experiment. It's a thought experiment and a experiment in form. The thought experiment begins with the question of what would it, where do we find places where forgetfulness is more useful than memory? Where, we love memory. We would not be humans if we did not remember. But there are times when memory lets us down. So the book explores those times and tries to figure out the virtues of forgetting. The formal experiment is, the book is episodic. I ended up writing lots and lots of short pieces. Most of them are short, less than a page, and then making a kind of collage so that the book doesn't exactly have an argument. The hope is that the reader will be prompted to begin to have arguments himself or herself with the material as it arises. And I did sort all my stuff into categories. And so there are 4 sections of the book, 4 notebooks. One is about mythology. The second one is about self. The third one is more political. And the fourth one is about spiritual life and creative life. And so I'll read just a couple of entries from each of these 4 sections. So the first one is about mythological material. And just to give you one example in general, all over the world, there is the story that to be born is a forgetting. That you used to know things when you were in some other state, and sadly, when you're born into the human body, you forget everything you knew. And I've always thought that this also is a kind of simple story about what it is to live your daily life. The lesson being that anytime you're going to really change, anytime you're going to be reborn tomorrow from what you were today, you have to forget something. So I'll just read, I think I have only one section from this, but it's one of the famous mythological moments. This is from Plato. A soldier by the name of Air was killed in battle. Days later, as his body lay on the funeral pyre, he came back to life and told of what he had seen in the land of the dead. When his soul had arrived in the underworld, he was told to watch and listen so that he might return as a messenger to the living. Then he witnessed the punishing of the wicked and the rewarding of the just. And he saw how all these souls convened to be born again, sometimes having journeyed in the underworld for 1,000 years. He saw how all were given a chance to choose their lot in life, and how they did so according to their wisdom or their foolishness. Their lots having been chosen, and the fates having spun the threads of each individual's irreversible destiny, they proceeded together in dry and stifling heat across the desert of Lecce. In the evening, they camped by the river of forgetfulness, whose waters no vessel could contain. Great thirst drove them to drink this water, those without wisdom drinking especially deeply. As each of them drank, they forgot everything. Then they slept. During the night, an earthquake came, and thunder, and all were swept up to the next life, like a shower of stars. However, at the river of forgetfulness, Air found himself forbidden to drink. He slept, and when he opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the funeral pyre, the sun rising. So the second section is about the self. And the simple point is that self-forgetting is a condition of personal growth and change and creativity. All memory gives rise to identity. And therefore, if you're going to shed your identity, you maybe should let go of your memories. In reply to a question about the effort he put into composing music with chance operations, John Cage said, "It's an attempt to open our minds to possibilities other than the ones we remember. Something has to be done to get us free of our memories." In a nod to his long interest in Buddhist teachings, Cage once released an audio disc titled The 10,000 Things, that being the phrase by which the old Dharma texts refer to the whole of existence, to the fullness of what is. As in the teachings of Japanese master Dogen, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to become one with the 10,000 things. So notice there's a sequence. First comes study, then forgetting. There is a path to be taken. There is a practice of forgetfulness. The poet Elizabeth Bishop once wrote a friend a letter about her reading of Darwin. Reading him, she says, quote, "One admires the beautiful, solid case being built up out of his heroic observations, almost unconscious or automatic. Then comes a sudden relaxation, a forgetful phase, and one feels the strangeness of his undertaking, sees the lonely young man, his eyes fixed on facts and minute details, sinking or sliding giddily off into the unknown. What one seems to want in art is the same thing necessary for its creation, a self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration." This is about the artist James Turrell. Turrell's sky spaces are enclosures for observing the unobstructed sky through a large opening in the ceiling. Turrell says that people often ask him, "Why do I have to go inside to see the sky? I can see it anywhere I want to." He replies, "But that's not telling the story of how we see the sky, of how very much prejudicial perception forms what we see. We award the sky its color. All sight depends on light, and it has been Turrell's long-term project to create situations in which we might drop our perceptual habits and see light simply as light. Turrell was born a Quaker and remembers the time when, as a child, he was first taken to Sunday meeting. My grandmother was trying to tell me what you did. Her explanation was, you go inside to greet the light. The light in Turrell's sky spaces is as unmediated as possible, in contrast to the long Christian tradition in which light enters through stained glass, often illuminating a story depicted there. Turrell prefers light itself as the message. If you use light to tell a story, he says, then you're not using the power of light, you're using the power of story. Turrell's light is not subordinated to image or narrative. Quote, if you have no image, no object, no focus, what do you have left? For me, it takes you to this primal relationship to light. So the third section is called Nation. And there was a French historian of religion named Ernest Renan, who years ago wrote an essay called What is a Nation? And he says, of course, it's a place where people have many things in common, but it's also a place where people have forgotten many things. And that it's important to have forgotten such that you can come together, because a lot of what you remember will divide you. So, and in this section, I explore some of the truth and reconciliation work in South Africa, a story about Native American, a massacre in the 19th century, and a long story about an African American man whose brother was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. It's hard to read sections of this because the stories are a little more complicated and the material is more complicated. So I would say one thing that, sometimes people talk about forgetting as forgiveness. Forgive and forget. I guess that's the phrase. And this always bothered me because I think they're really quite distinct. And that I think to get through a trauma of some kind, of many kinds, but in this case, national trauma, or some group that's been really wounded, there has to be a sequence of things. And to my mind, they begin with truth. You do have to know what happened. And sometimes that's very hard to figure out when people disagree. Second, there ought to be justice. If people really committed crimes, they should be brought to account. Third, it'd be nice if there are reparations, so that people who lost something can get it back. Sometimes there has to be what I call proper burial, so that what's been lost can be dealt with in a dignified way. And only after all of that kind of thing might you then have apology, and might even have forgiveness. So good luck. Anyway, I'll read just one little thing that does stand alone and kind of gets into this business of whether forgiving and forgetting are related. So this is from the writer Borges. In 1946, when Juan Perón became president of Argentina, Jorge Luis Borges found himself promoted from his position in the municipal library to a post as inspector of poultry and rabbits at the Buenos Aires municipal market. Years later, Borges was asked if he had forgiven the Peronistas. Forgotten, not forgiven, he said. Forgetting is the only form of forgiveness. It's also the only vengeance. Because if my counterparts see that I am thinking about them still, in some way I have become their slave. And if I forget them, I don't. I think forgiveness and forgetting, forgiveness and vengeance are two words for the same substance, which is oblivion. So the last section of the book is called Creator, or Creation. Doesn't assume any creator. There are many. And in the ancient world, there were arts of memory. People would learn how to memorize things, particularly in oral cultures where there was writing was not there or else belonged to the elites. And so I'm imagining that there could also be arts of forgetting, or there are forgetting practices, both in spiritual life and in artistic practice. And I read you 4 little sections from this part of the book. The painter Bryce Marden sometimes draws with a long stick dipped in ink, distancing himself from the work, deliberately interfering with his control of the stroke. Says Marden, the work starts out with observation and then automatic reaction. And then I back off. So there's a layering of different ways of drawing. It's the opposite of knowing yourself through analysis. It's more like knowing yourself by forgetting yourself, learning not to be so involved with yourself. How to forget. Use a long stick. How did Agnes Martin begin a painting? She would sit and wait for something to come to mind. Once, early in her career, she was thinking of the innocence of trees. And, quote, a grid came into my mind. It looked like innocence. From then on, her paintings were all variations on the grid. She imagined the mind as operating either by intellect or by inspiration. Intellect is a problem. It's the servant of the ego. It does all the conquering. It struggles with facts, discovering first one and then another until it makes a deduction. But in my opinion, that's just guesswork. Never going to find out the truth about life. Says Agnes Martin, I gave up facts entirely in order to have an empty mind for inspiration to come into. You have to practice quiet, empty mind. I gave up the intellect entirely. I had a hard time giving up evolution and the atomic theory, but I managed it. And I never have any ideas myself. I'm very careful not to have ideas. Plato's myth of air has it that the souls of the dead get to choose the life they will lead when they are reborn. Air witnessed several famous souls making their decisions. The last of these being Odysseus. Quote, now the memory of former sufferings having cured him of all ambition, he looked around a long time to find the uneventful life of an ordinary man. He had some difficulty in finding this, which was lying about and had been neglected by everybody else. When he saw it, he chose it with joy. We have no story of this ordinary man, for his is a life that brings no glory. It is a forgettable life, not a memorable one. Perhaps the reborn Odysseus, the happily uncelebrated man, still walks among us, living in a manner that leaves no mark on memory. I'll close with a poem. This is Fernando Pessoa, Portuguese poet. Rather the flight of the bird, passing and leaving no trace. Rather that than creatures passing, leaving tracks on the ground. The bird goes by and forgets, which is as it should be. The creature, no longer there and so perfectly useless, shows it was there, also perfectly useless. Remembering betrays nature, because yesterday's nature is not nature. What's past is nothing, and remembering is not seeing. Fly, bird, fly away. Teach me to disappear.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a lovely end to your book, Primer Forgetting. There's so many examples in all your writing, and obviously the Greek myths are very thick with many of these points that you make about the waters of the Styx, I guess, to forget, and then also the lotus eaters might touch on that a little bit more. But one thing, Lewis, that I was really struck by in your book was you brought something that you called tribal scars into the episodes. And the tribal scars for you, which you alluded to, was your relationship with your parents. And your father, I think, was an academic or a scientist, your mother a great reader, and they would often talk about your older brother and what a great reader he was, and he'd write letters home that he had read all these thick classics, and you were up in the fort reading comic books, and your mother had to pay you 50 cents to read a book, one summer when you were 10. And I guess I want to ask you, because you were accepted into a program that you said you didn't get into an Ivy League college of the kind that would have been acceptable to them, though you taught at many Ivy League colleges later, and MacArthur Fellow and all that stuff. But you realize that by the time you had all of these things, all of these accomplishments that they so wanted, they were dead. 10 years, passed away. And I want to ask you about your forgetting. By what process have you approached that as a personal forgetting, I guess?
Well, I suppose I've learned a lot from that Dogen Zenji simple set of instructions. I think of it as the study of the self is beginning to notice your habits of mind. and you may never get free of them, but but they could become a little more transparent, a little lighter, and uh, so I try to be conscious of that. I mean, in the examples you give, um, just to use that as a simple example, and actually let me set it up first briefly with where that image comes from, because in the Odyssey, Odysseus comes home in disguise, and nobody recognizes him. And the nurse is washing his legs and feet, and she realizes he has a scar on his leg, which he got as a young boy hunting boar with his grandfather. And the scar is tells her who it is. And our word trauma in the Greek, it really means wound. And there's a whole range of wounds. A little kind of nick on your finger is a wound. And then these days we think of serious trauma that is so wounding to the body or the mind that it takes tremendous therapy to get rid of it. But I tried to widen the sense of this of scarring, to say that everybody gets scarred. That in fact your parents are not doing a good job unless you leave the home scarred. And that you don't want to wander out in the world without having some sense of how it works. And so they desperately try to to shape you. And frankly, I think my parents did a pretty good job, but nonetheless, there I was shaped. And you become, I suppose, self-important in those things that you acquired. So that I think, for example, I have for many years been very judgmental of people who don't read a lot, or people who are not. There was a whole emphasis in my family on being smart. So you look down on dumb people. I mean, these are the dualisms by which we operate. And so being able to recognize them is the first step. And then sort of watching how they click into place.
Yeah.
I suppose the last thing is to say, so Buddhist therapy, Buddhist practice, I was going to say, has been very useful. But I was going to mention, I think psychotherapeutic work also has partly this function. You need somebody else to listen to you and say, you keep saying the same thing over and over again. Oh, really? Oh. So those are examples of the work.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. I found that part of the book very, very touching. And I'm also kind of interested in the primer, but also, of course, your other work generally. Where did you find that the many, many places where this water of forgetting was taken by those who had died? And I mean, I assume many other cultures, not just the Greek culture, which we're so familiar with, had those myths. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, it's often the case that, yes, the passage through the underworld or the passage into life is a forgetting. And there are many examples. It isn't always water, but it often is. And traveling over a river or traveling through a pond or, in some sense, the things have to be fluid and to get born, and that the fluid strips you in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, but so you found that in many places. Yeah, yeah.
Well, actually, I'll tell you. I mean, it's fun to do these from memory as opposed to reading them. But there's a thing in the Trobriand Islands where it's imagined that there are spirits who govern the world, and they know everything and they can do everything. They have ultimate power and ultimate knowledge. The problem is that it's very boring because there's nothing to do if you can do everything and nothing to think about. So they have figured out a way to make their existence less boring, and it is to be born into a human body. And to do so, you have to forget all the stuff you knew and begin again with what the body can teach you. So um, I like that sense that you wouldn't want to be omnipotent and know everything, because you'd want to be born again and forget.
Mm, mm. Now, touching on another story, if I might, from Primer, um, which you alluded to, was the murder of two young black men, Henry D. and Charles Moore, in Mississippi, 1964. And part of the reason I asked this is you were a freedom writer. You went down to Mississippi in 1964 when the call went out to register black voters. Tell us about your experience, if you might, in traveling down there and down in Mississippi, and kind of the personal side of Thomas More, the brother who you got to know and helped solve this cold case. It's a fascinating story.
Well, it's pretty complicated. And I mean, just to say briefly how I got there. So I was a college kid. I'd been influenced by the Quakers in high school. And so I had been hanging out with people who were politically active and socially aware. But I was 17, or I must have been 18. And the project that summer was to organize a parallel Democratic Party called the Freedom Democratic Party, and get people to sign up as members of this party, to choose delegates, and to go to the National Convention in Atlantic City in August of '64, and insist that the Democratic Party seat the Freedom Democrats and not the regular Dixie Democrats, which put poor Hubert Humphrey into a horrible vice. But anyway, we spent the summer registering voters, and in terms of my own experience, it was terrifying, and also I was innocent. I didn't even know how terrified I should be. And famously, there were 3 workers killed that summer, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. But I remember in Mississippi that somebody else had been killed. I couldn't remember before I began this book. My memory was that there'd been other murders, and that they had tried to find the bodies. And when they sent people out to look for them, they kept finding other bodies. I thought, oh, that's not good. If you walk the swamps of Mississippi, you find dead people who are not even known. So I decided to try to figure out what the true story was. And it was the 2 kids had been murdered before the summer began by the Klan. And while they were looking for Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, they came across these bodies in the Mississippi River. And then I stumbled upon a video of Thomas Moore, who was the older brother of one of the murdered kids. And Thomas Moore had worked with a Canadian filmmaker to try to figure out who the culprits were and get some justice. And this was almost 50 years later. And they managed to find 2 of the Klansmen. And they managed to get the federal government involved in prosecuting the case. They gave one of the Klansmen immunity, and they convicted the other one and put him in jail. The guy they gave immunity to stood up at the trial, and he turned to the families of the murdered kids, and he asked if they would forgive him. And Thomas Moore, who is Christian, decided to try to do that work. And in the book, there are references that tell you how to find the full story, and a lot of it's told in the book. But I was incredibly touched by that, and I, in fact, in May of 1964, I went back to Mississippi with Thomas and others to visit the graves of these kids, and we went to visit the site where the murders had taken place. And again, maybe one thing to say about it, I put it in a section of the book called Self, because this is a man working on himself. Thomas Moore had been in the army and had been in Vietnam and had been trained to kill. And when he got back, he wanted to go back to Meadville, Mississippi, and kill people. And uh, somehow he turned the corner and decided not to do that. Um, so, so I'm an example. Talk about polarities. I mean, this is a world to this day where we see things in black and white in terms of race. And Moore was trying to figure out how to not see his enemy in this simplified form. And I was going to say, I put it in the self section instead of the politics section because I think one man can sometimes do that. I think it's very difficult for a whole community.
What was his process of forgetting and forgiving? You got to know him pretty well.
Well, to go back to that list I gave you earlier, he had not known the full story of how his brother had died until he began this work. And they got the FBI files, which had not been released. So the first step was he got to know the truth, which he had not known. The second step was they put a guy in jail. So there was some justice. It wasn't, all you'd want. But those two things are key to what he went through. I don't think this is in the book, but actually, they managed to sue the town of Meadville because the police force there was complicit in the murders, and they got some reparations. So those pieces are there, and then he met a man who asked for forgiveness. I don't think it would have worked without these other things. And then both the murderer and Thomas were Christians, and they managed to find a way to join around some passages in the Bible that they agreed upon.
The murderer had become a minister, right?
Yeah, he might even have been before, but yes, he had a little church in Meadville. So, that's a process, but hard to come by.
And that's an example of sort of knowledge, recognition, in other words, sort of, and then forgiveness, and then possibly reparations and forgetting and healing, right? So the forgetting is the healing part.
And, just to say one thing about, it's not that Thomas More is ever going to forget what happened, but sort of late in this book, I decided there's such a thing, I call it free forgetting, which is to say, sometimes something obsesses us. You can't get it out of your mind. This is the real problem. And it harries you. It keeps you awake at night. So things that are truly unforgettable, this is a disaster. And traumatized people have this problem that the thing you can't get rid of it. So my sense is that sometimes you do a kind of work where now finally you can call it to mind or not. I work with some therapists here in Massachusetts around these issues. They had a wonderful phrase about that you can put down a gravestone. And the thing about a gravestone is you can visit it, but you do not have to. So at the end of some process, you can mark the thing as done. And now you're free to think about it or not. You're now back in charge of your own cognition. Whereas if you're obsessed with something, you're not running your own mind.
Sort of an opposite example in your book of the process of healing is a process that's not working well, and how people work with that current day, many, many years, century later, more than. So the Sand Creek massacre of 1864, as you know, don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but 150 mostly women and children were killed by the U.S. Army. And these were allies of the U.S. government. And so fast forward, terrible event, fast forward, and the descendants, the Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants are seeking to get greater knowledge and some sense of forgiveness and some sense of healing. And you've worked with these people. What, on a like a personal level, on a person-to-person, basis, what are they doing and how are they dealing with that?
I haven't worked directly with those people. I know that work through things that have been written about it. But I mean, the main thing in a lot of these is who's in charge. And the Native Americans, they want to be the people who put up the memorial and tell the story and get the story correct. So a lot of the Sand Creek Massacre, there's a book about it called A Misplaced Massacre. And it's the story of an attempt to memorialize, to build a memorial at the place where this happened. And the complexity of it has to do with things like who's in charge. Do they get to tell their own story or not? A lot of this goes back to this first issue. What's the truth and how do you know it? And we're seeing this today. A lot of the culture war fights are over people trying to tell the history as it happened, and people saying that history makes us uncomfortable. We're not going to have our children learn it. So, good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, some great work being done there. So I'd like to just touch on a couple of your other great classics, if I might, and ask you a few questions about The Gift, which is just an amazing book. We've got this expression, weaving and not interweaving, and all of the anecdotes and the thought process and the research for The Gift, that was back in 1983. That was a long time ago, but it's been reissued many, many times. And so there's something obviously in The Gift that's still very, very current for people. And it touched me. Deeply. One thing from my Zen sort of background is you talked about openness and open-heartedness. And the opposite of that is hard-heartedness. And the open-heartedness is the gift state of mind. And the the cold-heartedness is the commodity state. That's the commodity economy, where people are strangers to each other. In fact, that's preferred. And in the gift state, it sounded to me an awful lot about what we talk about awakening. So I wonder, you're pretty familiar with Buddhist thought and philosophy, and you have practiced a bit yourself. What is that gift state for you?
What is that gift state? That's a tough question. I mean, you talk about openness, like the Agnes Martin open mind. I mean, in a way, the book begins with the simple language facts that we talk this way. We talk about being gifted, meaning you have a talent. But the talent, where does it come from? And, I've had friends who were great mathematicians or who could play the guitar very well or could paint. And clearly, you don't learn this in school. You can discipline a talent, you can perfect a talent, but it comes with the package. And so that's one level of the gifted state, is to recognize what you have as a human being and figure out how to express it. And then for most creative types, the work only becomes interesting if things happen that you didn't plan. that you didn't expect. If you knew exactly how your novel is going to turn out, you'd be too boring to write. So, you try to get yourself into a position where awakening may be an accident, but you can make yourself accident prone. You can set up situations where you're more likely to receive something that you didn't know was there. And then I suppose the gifted state also has, in my, this is an idealist book. It imagines a world that we don't actually live in. But you might actually feel the impulse to reciprocate, that you might have a sense that you should do something in response to what you've received, and to give the work away, or if somebody's done a favor for you, to return the favor, or to do the favor to somebody else. So in all of that, you're more open to the world. You're not an individual anymore. You are divisible. You are undivided. And the original subtitle of that book was Imagination and the Erotic Life of Property, which later publishers thought was too confusing for the public. So we took it out. But I meant by erotic, it's about connection, about being in touch with other people. And I contrast it with the logos or commodity state.
Yeah.
The fact about purchase and sale is you can go into the hardware store and buy a pound of nails and pay money and leave and have absolutely no relationship. I could travel all the way to the Pacific Zen Institute and have no connection to anybody as I ordered the. So, and this is how mass societies work. You could not have one if you had to stop and care about everybody's family. Every time you bought a sandwich and say, "How's your grandmother, Mr. Sandwich Maker?" Soon you'd be stuck in the airport and never get to. So the gifted state is relational, more highly relational than others.
Yeah. And you use some great examples of the the Clinton, Tsimshian, the Northwest Indian culture, and the potlatch, and then bead exchange in down in the South Seas. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the gift. There's so much, and we really have a week's of material here. But one of my personal favorites poems I've discovered really more over COVID is Walt Whitman, and you wrote a lot about Walt Whitman in this gifted state quality through this lens of a gifted state. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about him, and then his sort of opposite was Ezra Pound, in a sense, who maybe early in his life he had some sort of awakening. I think that's actually a word that you used, and yet somehow society or his circumstances made it difficult for that to come out for him. Could you talk about Whitman and then kind of contrast him with Pound in the next 50 or 60 minutes?
You keep asking these big questions. So, I have an image of Whitman as somebody who, he's like a huge, some kind of lung that inhales the world and makes a poem out of it and exhales it as a poem on the page. The objects in the world and the people in the world are like dumb ministers, in the sense that they don't have speech, but they minister, they address him, and then he gives them speech, and that goes out into the world. And I read Song of Myself as a description of this state. The Pound case is a lot more complicated. I actually think that Pound, late in life, was mentally ill. I don't mean to forgive his horrible opinions by that, but I do think he was crazy. And you know, he was a brilliant and generous and remarkable young poet up until the 30s. I mean, he was a help to Pound, he was a help to Hemingway, he was a help to W.B. Yeats. He was himself a great poet. In the 30s in Italy, he became a fascist and supported Mussolini and got on the radio and broadcast against the United States. At the end of the war, he was arrested and brought back to the United States and tried for treason. And he pleaded insanity. And they put him in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. I think he should have not pleaded. I think it would have been interesting to see, we could have put him in jail, then there would have been justice, and then he could have gone. But at any rate, so the Pound case is more complicated. And then it's a puzzle what to do with an artist like this. And so I end with the story about Allen Ginsberg, because Allen learned a lot from Pound and was grateful for that. And late in Pound's life, Allen Ginsberg goes to visit him in Rapallo. And the way Ginsberg tells it, there's a story that's somewhat redemptive. Ginsberg was such a generous soul that I've always wondered. There probably were other ways to tell that story, but it's the way he tells it. There's a kind of return to the light of earlier Pound's work. So, yeah. So there's 40 pages on each of these in the book, if you care.
Yeah, yeah. No, I thought the section on Whitman was just fabulous. And he had a conflicted life, right? In terms of his passions and how he could express them in the society in which he lived.
Yeah, I mean, Whitman was gay, and it was a time when that had no place in public life. And it's remarkable how successful he was in finding the intimacy he needed. It really, he had boyfriends who, loved him. So that's nice.
Yeah, yeah. So just moving on to another great work, and I'm sorry we can't do, sufficient justice to the gift, but maybe John and Allison, shortly we'll have some questions. So, but Trickster Makes the World. Again, you went out and you investigated, many cultures and the trickster image in the culture. I love the story. Tell us the story about where you first met Coyote, or when you met Coyote hitchhiking.
So this opens the book. There's a story about hitchhiking out west, and I get picked up by some Navajo men, and they tell, there's a famous Coyote story. You've got the eye juggler. He takes his eye. He learns how to take his eyeballs out and throw them up into a tree, and you can see great distances. And what usually happens in Coyote stories is there's certain rules, and then he fails to follow the rules and has horrible trouble. And so the spirit who tells him how to do this trick says, you just do it 3 times, don't do it 4. And of course he does it 4 times. And then he's lost his eyes. And the story goes on from there. So, the trickster, the simple definition of this character, he's the sacred boundary crosser. So there are always boundaries, and there have to be, and distinctions made, even black and white, useful for painters. And social boundaries. And the trickster is the figure who can figure out how to cross them. And it has to be a trickster because these boundaries matter. We care that the world will have structure and coherence. So he needs to be sneaky and a thief and a liar and so forth. But I call him the sacred boundary crosser because, in fact, he has a sacred function, which is to revive the world, because all structures begin to get old and dry and dead. And change has to come from someplace. And that's this character's role, is to come in and see if the old distinction still holds up. Or maybe not. Maybe you could cross this boundary and it turns out the world goes on. Who knows? So in general, that's the function of this character.
Yeah, and a great story you used was Hermes, at 1 year old, stealing Apollo's cattle. Can you tell us about that story and maybe what it meant for you?
well, just to link it to what I just said,
Or Wendale, sorry, yeah.
The historical reading of that story is it happens at a moment when the Greek culture is shifting from an agrarian aristocracy to a merchant culture, and that the Homeric hymn to Hermes is a story about the change of this boundary. That suddenly you have a character who is himself a trader and a traveler and a merchant, and the story is funny, so it gets into your mind. So, at any rate, that story, there's so much to say. You see Hermes as an inventive character. He kills a turtle and makes the first lyre out of it, and he sings a song to Apollo, and the song is so charming that Apollo gives up his claim to the cattle and gives Hermes a place in the world. Maybe one more thing to say about this. When Hermes is the illegitimate child of Zeus and a nymph, and at the beginning of the story, it's not clear what his status will be. He wants to be an Olympian. He wants to be part of the pantheon. And the way the story works is he figures out how to steal and lie and cheat until he is one of the pantheon. And I read it as the story of any outsider. I juxtapose it with the story of Frederick Douglass, the American slave, who at the end of his life is an actor in the federal government in Washington, D.C. And in terms of theft, I mean, Douglass was a very moral man, but at the beginning of his life, he steals literacy and he steals himself. So there are key thefts in any act of systemic freedom.
Yeah, yeah. You and I had talked earlier about, Zen koans and stories of our lives, and you had said where a trickster, if there's a gate, there's always a trickster there, and the fact that a trickster steals and possibly steals any idea of who you think you are, but I don't know. What do you think? Is a Zen koan either a trickster, or is it a tool of a trickster? Or?
I understand you have someone in your community who's an expert on this. Maybe we should ask him.
Well, I'm kind of right. We may hear from him shortly, but I kind of like to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm not a koan expert, but I would say that yes. I mean, I think of koans often as kind of mind jamming. The way you normally think, it turns out to be not a good way to solve or figure out how to respond. You don't solve, respond to it. So yeah, where there's a gate or a lock or a boundary or a wall, and then in this case it would be in your mental thinking. I mean, the one I use in the book is in the Primer for Forgetting, is the one about the man who, I think he's asked to think of this. Could be anyone that your face before your parents were born. So I can't figure it out. And he says to his teacher, "Well, tell me the answer." He says, "If I told you the answer, you'd hate me. You have to figure out yourself." So he gives up entirely, and he spends years sweeping the dust around the window. And then one day, a stone hits a piece of bamboo and goes bing, boom, and suddenly But it isn't just that he hears the sound. He says, "I forgot everything I knew." So again, there's some sense in which everything you know stands in the way of some other kind of perception. So maybe one function of koans is to get you so weary with trying to know something that you give up. But I'm no expert on koans.
Well, that was not too bad. Well, let me turn it over to to John and Allison, perhaps you folks have a few questions or thoughts.
The problem is not finding a thought. The problem is having so many. um, Let me go in through. I think the thing about forgetting is one of the great issues of our time, right? Like, what do we do with suddenly we're aware of, we're not just locally aware of painful things, but we're internationally aware of, traumatic things, and how do we work with that? So I think your book is wonderful. Just take that on. You don't have to. You're not going to answer it or solve it, but to take that on seems somehow. I think that's that's kind of a very Zen thing, to just take it on and start examining it and looking at it from this side and that side and the Greek side, and just the way you do with the gift from the Trevian Islanders to Whitman or to whatever. And I was thinking about, I was rereading The Gift because, and thinking about, there's a great stuff in Whitman where he does talk like a Tang Dynasty Chinese, poet, the boy became the lilacs and things like, he went out in the morning. And it's wonderful what a pure experience and expression he has, and it's one of the solutions. It's definitely one of that. So I also thought that I actually mourned the loss of the erotic in the subtitle when the publishers changed it. And I completely could tell why they changed it, but still. But there's that feel that Whitman just carries with him, that sort of glow of I don't know, we're at peace with the strangers of the world, and we're one with it. We're not separating ourselves and blaming bits of the world and things like that. And so that seems really an important thing. And I think your thing about individuals can, like the older brother, the older Moore gentleman, can sort of, they can get across that gulf, but it's very hard for a whole culture to get across it. The forgiveness issue. So that's kind of, I don't know. I was glad you said that, because it's sort of interesting and somehow something for us to take into account. And also I noticed, some of us also try to do the inner work as well as some of the outer work, and one of the things you can never quite, I think people never quite get rid of, is their grudges, and it's not the grudges, but that thing in the mind that brings something up that's opposed to an angry or hurt or wounded or something. I have a friend who's kind of famous in his world, and he writes some things that sell very well, and he knows actually a lot about Zen, but he keeps telling me how in Zen you never have these dark states, and you never and I said, oh, that's great. So I sent him this kind of nasty note in a way, saying, you don't know anything about Zen. And he got enraged. So I thought that was kind of progress. But so the fact that in some way we've got to welcome that shadowy, troubled quality in life, and not either surrender to it or enact it, so I don't know. I think Whitman's a beautiful example for me of someone who seems to let all of that into his heart, comes out. So, and I notice, koans, I think, are very close to. They do have that puzzle quality, but they're also very close to dreams in that they're an environment that they work on you without caring much about your opinion. And I think that Shang Yan, the guy who hit the bamboo with the pill, he'd given up, and but the koan hadn't given up, and one talk, and I forgot all I knew. So it's a good example of that. And so I'm quite interested in the ways we can touch each other, and in a way that's what love is, that perhaps that we can touch each other, and then it goes down in deep, and we continue our journey, and then gradually, the thing we had been tremendously sad about or traumatized by or whatever, somehow we don't forget it, but it comes to, we're not holding it in that dark way anymore. So, because I'm trying to link the creative force with the forgetting force.
Well, I'll take it up from there because I was very interested, Lewis, in a couple of things you said about creativity. And I was absolutely charmed by the story about Agnes Martin and just all this list of things that she had to forget, and that she had to give up evolution, and she had a very hard time giving up evolution. And how you said that everything that you know stands in the way of the creative, and in a way you have to. I remember there's been some. I'm a painter, and there've been some paintings where I've actually, especially if I'm working on a human face, I'll have to take my glasses off and work in very low light so that I can't hold in my mind the way a face is supposed to look. And it's a kind of enforced forgetting, which is very interesting. And the other thing I was really interested in, that you taught writing at Harvard. And so you were working with these kids who had a whole lot of, I imagine, very in order to get into Harvard, you have to have a lot of ideas about knowing and certainty, particularly about writing. And how did you work with them? And what did you do to open up this gate? Actually, my daughter is teaching writing at Harvard right now, so I'm particularly interested.
I don't think I did anything brilliant. The way, the advantage of a writing workshop for undergraduates is that they get to realize that there's somebody else who's reading their work. So if you have 15 young people in the room and one of them has written something everybody reads, the writer gets to hear that it didn't make any sense to 14 other people, or that it did, or so there's a way in which the simple act of calling an audience into being is going to change the way you write. I think we all have ego investment in writing, and and particularly maybe when you're younger. Why does anybody who's 18 years old want to write a novel? Well, there has to be a lot of self-importance in it, and so to make it more of a communal affair is a simple way to widen the sense of, yourself has to contain your audience as well. And I suppose, when I began teaching, I tried to teach the way I write, and it turned out that was a mistake, because everybody has to figure out their own way to write. And I think I'm actually kind of hard on myself in a way that I would not. I pitied my students who had to suffer while I learned not to do that. So you mostly learn to write by writing, and so the change in my lifetime, when I was an undergraduate, there were no writing workshops. Now there are. So it's the Academy has realized that it's worth letting students have the time to write, and then with enough time, they may become better writers.
Well, what I loved about what you just described was, I can't remember the phrase you used, something about conjuring an audience into being or something.
Yeah.
But how, when it's just me writing for, let's say, my professor, if I'm writing, there's this whole group there, it brings uncertainty into my own writing, because I don't know what all these minds the response is uncertain. So it infuses the writing process maybe with a little uncertainty.
Yeah. There's a wonderful line in Annie Dillard book. She has a book about the writing life. And, she had a painter friend who loved the smell of paint. and she thought that was kind of an essential piece of being a painter. And so somebody asked her, should I be a writer? And she said, well, do you love sentences? You love sentences? So I think that's if you don't love sentences, it's not your profession.
Well, Lewis, I've got an example that you gave of writing a poem. May I read it? It's a very short paragraph.
Okay.
How to write a poem. Myself, when writing poems, I practice revision by forgetting. I write a draft of a poem and then another and another, allowing the versions to pile up in a jumble. It all sits there in a shapeless pile, clammy with fatigue. Then I set it aside for at least one day. Then I write the poem from memory. Great chunks will have fallen into oblivion, while others will have returned clarified from the pool. The double goddess attends, dropping the discord to reveal the harmony.
Sounds wonderful. I don't think it works quite as well as it seems in that description, but it is true that Mnemosyne is the mother of the muses in Greek mythology, and my reading of this is that, well, it's said in the Greek myth that she helps you remember the golden age and forget the current age of the current age, and so it's a double goddess, and all remembering is an act of forgetting simultaneously. If you remembered everything, you would be in trouble. So, yeah, it could be part of the practice. I like this image of taking off your glasses. Was it while painting? Yeah, I've done the same thing actually. I took a painting class, and my teacher used to say, "Squint, squint." What she meant, I think, was to look at the colors differently than directly on. And I realized instead of squinting, I could take my glasses off, and you just see differently. And I don't know if it connects directly with forgetting, but it's a way of editing your perception.
Can I?
Please, yeah, Joe.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about in Zen, I suppose we're interested in some sort of transformation, some vaguely alchemical process and so one needs error, and most people who take up Zen, like me, when I took up Zen, I really wanted to avoid how error prone my consciousness seemed to be. I wanted to work with that, and so. And I think in some ways all your books perhaps address that to some degree with Coyote and things, But and also I was very, very interested. I don't know if it's in this direction or not, but very interested in the way you're not making a case in the prime of forgetting that it's more like there's some other authors have done this, like Benjamin's Arcades project, but Colosso, I think but maybe not. But there's something about focusing on the leaves instead of the trunk and allowing the leaves to build the universe for us. And that sort of.
Well, I liked what you said earlier, John, about to take this problem and just sit with it, as opposed to thinking you're going to solve it or having a solution that you're going to argue for. And I think the episodic form of that book is a device for foregrounding the fact that it's not. I mean, there are lines of argument in the book, but they keep getting interrupted.
Well, I think they're loosely held, and that you're allowed to contradict yourself, as Whitman mentioned, and so on. So.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really important. Well, for our work, that's really important. We can be wrong and things. Well, thank you.
Lewis, we have your book of poetry, and I love the title itself. This error is the sign of love. You get free membership in the PZI for that. And yeah, I just love your description of how you write poetry. You call yourself a poet. You've published essays, far more, many of these. You've got many, many translations, but you call yourself first and foremost a poet. And so I would really love to have you read one of your poems in closing, so we just get a sense of your wonderful poetry. It was so clear that an awful lot of the poetry from this book, and it's an older book, was taken from the time when you were an orderly, or you worked on a ward in a hospital for it was a drug tank, really. I mean, where people were recovering, and you love that work, and it was, human bodily fluids of every kind and every human experience on the night shift and the graveyard shift, and that obviously had a big impact on your poetry.
Okay, I've called up a few poems on my website. Has some PDF copies of poems, and I'll read the two short ones that begin it. This is called "On the Gray Wolf River." I was in Newport Townsend, Washington, hiking in the mountains. Little ouzel bird under cliffs of pillow lava, over ice green glacier rapids. Should I go back to the university? And this is called Desert, and it has an epigram from Simone Weil, who says, "We have to be in a desert, for he whom we love is absent. We have to be in a desert, for he whom we love is absent." Early morning in the mist, saturated with light, obscures the disappearing power lines. A damp obscurity, but a desert nonetheless. Birds that fly into it lose their bodies and survive as the songs of birds. The tallest locust is nothing but the rustle of its leaves. Slowly the sun cuts and burns the haze away, to re-embody each in a seedy yellow sleep. All right, those are some poems.
Nice. Thank you. You read a poem at the opening, and somebody was asking what the title of the poem and who the author was again, the poet?
Oh, it's Fernando Pessoa. And it's the last page in the book, Primer for Forgetting. I don't remember the title of it, but it's so.
So is writing a long stick, somebody asks?
Well, again, I mean, what Bryce Martin is saying is to have some device that puts a distance between you and your intentions. So his use of a long stick instead of a short paintbrush is one. But so what would it be in writing? I mean, anyway, to jumble up what you're doing. I think John Cage's Chance Operations is always a good way to put a long stick between you and what you intend to do. So, open the dictionary to 3 pages at random and pick a word from the top left corner of each, and then write a poem about that.
Yeah, nice. Did I hear Lewis say that awakening might be an accident, but you can make yourself accident prone? Yeah. I forgot who you cited that. It's
I think I got that from Jane Hirschfeld, but she might have got it from
yeah, it's been kicking around for a long time, but it's a great line. So Lewis, thank you so much. It's really, really enjoyable evening. I really appreciate you coming on, and I so appreciate your work. These things, they move out, in concentric circles, rings of, and the ripples in the pond, and so many people receive the gift of your writing that you may never meet or may never know, but it's there, and I thank you for that.
Well, I thank you for the attention you paid to this work. Writers need readers, and it's wonderful to get to hear a responsive call after you speak something into the world, have somebody speak back. So thank you also for your attention.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us this Pacific Zen Luminaries series.